And we're going to get started. Good evening. My name is Julie Tai. I am president of the New York League of Conservation Voters and the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. I'd like to remind everybody that this event tonight is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. I want to thank all of the candidates and staff for joining us today. I think, wanted to introduce folks. Is that right, Carlos?
Yeah, if everyone can just drop your name in the chat and the campaign that you're affiliated with, and what if you're running for a council district, what district that is, that would be great so we can get to know who's here.
Great. Thank you for that. So these discussions are designed to educate and inform campaigns for city council, borough president, controller, and mayor on key environmental and public health issues facing our city. We hope to teach you about important environmental issues so that you're informed as you continue to run for office and while you're in office. For first-time candidates, we think of this as just the beginning of a fruitful relationship with you and hope we can continue to partner with you on these priority issues. Tonight, we have two panel discussions. One about waste management, something that I think we can all relate to, and one about building emissions. Our first panel will cover waste management. Reducing waste has been one of our top priorities for decades. The recycling system in crisis and the suspension of the city's organic waste collection program, we have been moving backwards on our zero waste goals, and we need to rectify that. Fortunately, many of our elected officials are working on policies to decrease the burden on our landfills by encouraging New Yorkers and businesses to end reliance on disposable products and reduce the amount of waste we're generating in the first place. There's more work to be done, and we look forward to hearing more during tonight's discussion. If you have questions for the panelists, you can use the Q&A function. We will address the questions at the end of each panel. Now we'll get started with our first round of panelists. I am pleased to be joined by Bridget Anderson. Bridget is the New York City Department of Sanitation's Deputy Commissioner for Recycling and Sustainability. She's responsible for planning, implementation, and tracking DSNY sustainability initiatives around recycling, composting, household hazardous waste and e-waste, textile recoveries, and waste reduction. She directs the agency's sustainable waste management policy research and program development and its strategic partnerships with the local reuse sector. She's overseen New York City's curbside composting program from its 2013 pilot rollout through its expansion to a third of New York City residents by 2018. And sadly, she also had to oversee its suspension during the COVID-19 pandemic and related budgetary crisis. So Bridget, I would like to have you start.
Great. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for allowing me from my government perch to provide some perspective and insight. So next slide. One of the things we wanted to speak about very high level are the zero waste goals that New York City has. Mayor de Blasio did establish a zero waste to landfills by 2030 goal. That goal has now been softened. It is still part of the One NYC 2050 policy agenda. It is within the climate agenda, but it's now an initiative without necessarily a timeline or a deadline. This is unfortunate because it softens our ability to keep momentum going. Zero waste to landfills, what does that mean? It means reducing waste, so reuse and donations. And we've primarily been tackling that through developing a nonprofit network of partners who we try to increase the reuse and the donations going to those partners. Our curbside recycling program, which has been the bread and butter of our city's diversion practices for 30 years, we only capture 50% of the recyclables that should be going into the recycling trucks. And so that there's still a lot of room for improvement there. Composting, which is the organic material that is suitable for beneficial reuse, whether it goes directly to compost, yard waste and food waste, or whether it goes through an anaerobic digestion system for energy generation, followed by composting of the digestate. Toxic reduction is a critical path part of our waste management work. This is a small percentage of the waste stream, but it has a disproportionate negative impact environmentally. So this is your electronic waste, your hazardous waste materials, so your paints, your solvents, your chemicals. And litter rejection is a critical path element of zero waste landfills as well. Anything that goes down the drain and ends up having to be caught by Department of Environmental Protection or ends up in the waterways is a waste burden for us as well. So this waste pie gives you a general sense. What is in the residential waste stream in New York City? A third of that waste are designated recyclables and should be recycled. We only capture half of those recyclables in our recycling bin today. A third of the waste is the orange section, which is organic, suitable for composting. Again, this is a fledgling program that we had, and due to budgetary related reasons, this program has currently largely been suspended. I will say over the past several years, we have had a very productive collaboration between sanitation, government, and the advocacy community to try to advance aggressive goals, and we'll talk about those on the next few slides. And where we've been able to actually pass legislation, we've made the most gains. And so we want to look at that as a tool as we move forward. Where can legislation help move us in the right direction? And obviously the financial crisis has put an immense strain on our ability to advance these goals. Next slide. So organic waste, this is critical path for our climate goals. This is critical for reducing waste to landfills. And again, we have an unfortunate reality. Our residential curbside composting program has been suspended. The funding has been cut through June of 2022. So we are in a moment now where we're going back. We're studying how we did it the first time around. Is there a way we could bring it back better, more efficiently? But the reality is this costs money, and we have to find a path to fund and pay for this important program moving forward. Also suspended have been seasonal leaf collections. We not only generate food waste, we generate a lot of leaf and woody debris material, and this is a seasonal program that has also had to be cut. We do have a passionate group of people who are maintaining the food scrap drop-off program. We have nonprofit partners, and they do a lot with very little money and very little support, but we do as much as we can. It's critical for education, for making sure people understand why would we separate food scraps in the first place. It makes compost. We have had record-breaking numbers of participation in these drop-off sites. We have over 100 sites open. We had a peak of 175 before COVID. And so critical path is maintaining the funding for the food scrap drop-off program while we're trying to bring back the curbside program. And for commercial waste, we did pass a law that requires businesses to separate their organic waste for beneficial reuse. And this is a fully implemented law. We are now in the process of educating and enforcing this law. Obviously, there has been a pause during COVID, but we think this will help us move in the right direction on organic waste. Next slide. Single-use plastics, we have had a couple of positive advancements over the last couple of years. One is with expanded polystyrene, so that is your foam products. New York City actually passed a law in 2013, and it was followed by years of litigation, and eventually it was found in favor for New York City, which means we were able to actually implement this ban. So we are now in the process of implementing this ban and also enforcing for businesses who are still using these products. So this we feel like is important, and it's been enforced, and it's been a useful tool. We do not have outcome measures yet of how much foam has decreased in the waste stream, but this is something we look to study in the next couple of years. Next slide. And most recently, New York State passed a carryout bag ban. So plastic bags are banned, and you have to pay a 5-cent fee in New York City for paper bags. The good part about this is that we actually get money back from the state to distribute reusable bags. And so one of the things we're trying to do is find as many opportunities as we can to get reusable bags out into the community and being used so that people do not have to pay the 5 cents for their paper bags. We have distributed over 1 million bags so far since we started this program. Next slide. And Mayor de Blasio has executed 2 orders, 42 and 54, to eliminate the unnecessary use of single-use plastics within city government. And this is something that it's a great start, but we could even make it stronger. So we've been focused in government on creating the procurements so that there are alternatives used by city government to reduce the unnecessary use of plastic water bottles, beverage bottles. This includes the sale of these items on city property, so in parks and with vendors. and also to eliminate the use of single-use plastic foodware for compostable alternatives. And moving forward, the thing that we're tracking closely, which could be a game changer for us in terms of achieving recycling at a higher pace, stabilizing this and reducing the cost burden for taxpayers, is something called extended producer responsibility, where the producers of the packaging that we recycle actually has to be paid for. The producers actually have to pay for the costs of recycling these items. So we're pushing this hard at the state level, and hopeful that it will create some benefits for New York City should it pass. Next slide. Commercial waste zones. So on the commercial sector, sanitation collects residential waste, institutional waste, but private haulers collect from businesses. There was landmark legislation in 2019 to reform this industry and to create geographic zones to reduce truck traffic, improve safety, and efficiency of this system. This law was passed. Again, that is the perfect first step. The other two folks on our panel will speak more about this, about the process that led us to this law. And now we're focusing within government of actually implementing the law. So we created the 20 geographic zones. We have initiated the first part of an RFP to actually choose carters and vendors. And we've been passing rules and regulations for what will be expected of those carters and the businesses who are served by them. Next slide. And the last thing I would say, we have had an achievement related to waste equity, reducing transfer station capacity for trash material while maintaining our ability to leverage transfer station capacity for recycling and organic waste. But this is, again, a good start and not necessarily where we need to end up. And I think my colleagues will speak more about this as well. I think that is my last slide. It's a very quick overview of certain things that have been happening over the last few years. And again, the work is not done, and we look forward to working alongside our elected officials and our advocates and environmental colleagues to keep the pressure on.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. There's a lot going on, and we know you're doing what you can within the constraints of your resources. Our next panelist is Eric Goldstein. Eric is a senior attorney and New York City Environment Director at the Natural Resources Defense Council. More than 3 decades ago, he helped create NRDC's urban program. He gained nationwide attention in the early 1980s for spearheading the public campaign to get lead out of gasoline. Since then, Eric has been one of the New York region's leading environmental advocates on such issues as solid waste, drinking water, clean air, and environmental justice. He helped draft, support, and enforce New York City's landmark 1989 mandatory recycling law, and has led NRDC's efforts to transform the way trash is handled across the state, from primary reliance on landfilling and incineration to making recycling, composting, waste prevention, and equity the cornerstones of waste policy. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. As Julie said, I'm Eric Goldstein, and I've been advocating for smarter waste policies in New York City for about 36 years. I have 9 minutes tonight. That's 4 years for every minute. So I'm going to speak quickly, but you can always reach me at egoldstein@nrdc.org. I'll tell you just a little background to add to what you've heard from Bridget, and then talk about 2 issues where you can have a major impact in the council in the years to come: composting and plastics. First, just to fill in a little background, New Yorkers produce about 24,000 tons a day of waste, roughly. About half of the waste stream, about 12,000 tons a day, is handled by New York City's Department of Sanitation. That's the residential and institutional waste. It's collected in the white trucks that we all see around the city. The rest of the waste, 12,000 tons a day, maybe even more in non-COVID periods, is collected from commercial and industrial establishments by private carters. You'll hear a little bit more about that later in the panel. My focus tonight will be on the residential waste stream. And New Yorkers produce a lot of waste, 2,000 pounds per household per year. 2,000 pounds of household per year is in the municipal waste stream. And of course, that doesn't count all the other waste that's generated upstream. In other words, when those products are manufactured, when you use some and generate waste in a commercial establishment or anything else, just the residential household waste, 2,000 pounds every year. So, and it's also an expensive proposition for New York City to dispose of this waste. What happens to the waste that the sanitation department collects? As you heard from Bridget, something about 18% or so, less than 20% is recycled. The overwhelming amount of waste we generate these days is sent to landfills or burned in incinerators. Landfills as far away as South Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, incinerators upstate New York, as close as Newark, New Jersey. Both of those are problematic. We'll get to that in a moment. So as Julie said, NRDC's position, which is widely shared by environmental activists and environmental justice activists around the city, is that we need to switch New York City policy from primary reliance on landfilling and incineration to making waste prevention, recycling, composting, and equity the cornerstones of city waste policy. As I said, there are two issues that are likely to come before the council in the years ahead where you can really make a difference, both in terms of environmental protection and making the quality of life better for residents and communities across the city, and also for city taxpayers, because our current system is very expensive. The first of these, as Bridget said, is composting. About 31% of our waste stream is suitable for compost. That's organics, food waste and yard waste, and food, soil, paper products. Right now, again, the overwhelming amount of that is sent to landfills or incinerators. If you send food waste and yard waste to an incinerator, it fouls up the burn. Incinerators are already a source of air pollution. And when you put in all of that heavy liquid material, it's not only expensive, but it generates additional air contaminants. When you bury food waste and yard waste in landfills, it generates methane. Methane is an extremely potent global warming gas. And so that's problematic. On the other hand, if we compost our food waste and yard waste, we get useful product. It can be used as fertilizer. It can replace chemical fertilizers. It's a soil stabilizer. There are many productive things we could do. It helps plants grow and trees grow. So we can use compost in many sensible locations. There are two city laws Bridget mentioned that deal with encouraging composting. One on the commercial side, that's Local Law 146 of 2013, which has gradually built up the requirements for restaurants and other major food service establishments to compost their waste. And when the commercial system gets back on track after COVID, that should be a fairly effective mechanism for ensuring food waste at the commercial level is composted. But at the local level, where a third of our waste is food waste or yard waste, the program has been going backwards. Again, as Bridget indicated, Local Law 77 of 2013 set up a voluntary residential curbside program and set up a school composting collection program. Those have all been suspended, as has the community composting efforts that have set up with nonprofit help drop-off locations around the city. Again, thanks to the city council, about 100 drop-off locations have been reinstated as of September. So very dedicated New Yorkers can drop off their compost at these sites, but much more is needed. Ultimately, what we need to have the council take action on is to advance universal composting, make food waste composting collections available to every household throughout the city. And ultimately that will save taxpayers money. Why? Because it costs more to take a ton of waste to an incinerator or a landfill than it does to take a ton of organic waste to a composting facility. It's going to take some time to get there, but we need to begin the transition in 2021. We hope that you and your principals will help on that. Final topic is plastics. Plastics, as everybody should know by now, are a real environmental problem. Why? They're difficult to recycle, and nationwide, maybe 10%, even less, of plastics are being recycled. Second, the manufacture of plastics is a healthcare problem for workers. Third, plastics are often disposed of improperly, and they get everywhere in the environment. They get in our waterways, they're found in the Arctic, they're found in the Pacific garbage patch, Every corner of the earth is covered with plastics. Plastics are in our fish, the marine mammals, the food we eat, and even in our bodies. That's not a good thing. So there has been some legislation, as Bridget said, in the last couple of years to cut back on some of the worst single-use plastics. Again, we all like plastics when it comes to making artificial hearts, medical products, and things like that. But the fossil fuel industry uses plastics as a major income source. And so we need to eliminate the wasteful plastics that our parents and our grandparents very easily lived without. And so potential legislation pending in the council now would make straws, plastic straws, and plastic food utensils, forks, knives, and spoons available only on request. We all have experienced ordering some takeout food, even though we get it at home where we have our silverware, it comes with 2 or 3 packets of plastic utensils that ends up going in our trash. We need to pay to get rid of it, and it becomes a nuisance in the environmental world for a long, long time. As I think I also should have mentioned, plastic bags is another area where we produce billions of them every year in New York City and New York State. There is now new legislation first passed in the city that put a fee on plastic bags, and now a statewide bill that took law just this past year that now bans plastic bags and puts a small fee on paper bags. The idea is to encourage wherever we can reusables. It's not a money generating idea. It's an idea of creating an atmosphere that encourages people to go back to reusables, which around the nation and the world folks are doing. So the 2 pieces of legislation pending in the council, utensils and straws only on request. There's also a proposal for filling up reusable containers so that if you go into a Starbucks in a place like that, you want to bring your reusable container, they will fill it up and maybe you'll even get a discount. Ultimately, we're not going to solve the global warming problem, the climate crisis, unless we find a way to cut back on single-use throwaway plastics that are used and are a momentary convenience, but remain in the environment and in our city and landfills for a century or more. Much more to say, but no more time. Thank you for listening.
There's always more to talk about for sure. So thank you very much. Our next panelist is Phoebe Flaherty. Phoebe is an organizer at Align, the Alliance for a Greater New York. She coordinates the Transform Don't Trash Coalition, a coalition of labor, community, and environmental justice organizations working towards transforming commercial waste collection in New York City, as we've heard about a little bit, and the Climate Works for All Coalition, a coalition of labor, community, and environmental justice coalitions that helped pass local law in 1997 and is currently working to create 100,000 good green jobs in New York City. Phoebe.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here tonight, and it's been great to hear from Bridget and Eric about the work they're leading in organics and plastics and other really important areas. And I'll be focusing right now on the work that we've been leading with the Transform Don't Trash Coalition on commercial waste zones. So Align, my organization, has been leading the Transform Don't Trash Coalition, a coalition of labor, climate, environmental justice organizations fighting to reform how commercial waste is collected. And we've been organizing together for 6 years. And we took on this campaign because it's at the intersection of our area of focus, economic justice and environmental justice. Right now, commercial waste collection in New York City is kind of like the Wild West, with diesel fuel trucks traveling hundreds of unnecessary miles each night. Recycling and composting services are not guaranteed. Workers working long hours without protection in unsafe vehicles, and creating unsafe conditions for workers and others on the streets in New York City as well. Today, each business in the city is on its own to find a waste hauler, choosing from one of 90 carters. This results in multiple carters driving through neighborhoods each night, picking up from businesses on the same block. And so, for example, near Rockefeller Center, in a 5-block stretch, there are 27 carting companies collecting trash from 86 different businesses. In the last 10 years, dozens of people have been killed by private garbage trucks. And so in cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco. In comparison, New York has a 3 times higher crash rate, and all those other cities have waste zone systems. And really the problem is that, the Carters are concerned with maximizing profits, expense, climate, well-being of workers, and safety of New Yorkers. And so for the past 6 years, we have been fighting for the city to adopt and implement commercial waste zones. And as we heard from Bridget, in the fall of 2019, we were successful in the legislation establishing the program with DSNY was passed. Commercial waste zones will have a huge impact not only on commercial waste and how it's collected, but as a necessary step to move our city on the path towards net zero emissions by 2050 and address racial equity and economic justice for sanitation workers and address environmental injustice in frontline EJ communities. And as we heard a little bit from Bridget too, it's going to establish zones in which Carters will be selected to operate, reducing the number of Carters per neighborhood, in some cases from dozens to 3 at most. And the reduction of Carters per neighborhood will mean shorter routes, meaning fewer diesel truck miles traveled each night and fewer traffic and safety violations. In terms of the impact on the climate, it's going to be huge. The policy will reduce more than 2 million tons of greenhouse gas annually and cut garbage traffic extensively. And commercial waste zones will increase our ability for commercial recycling rate as well. And more protections come in the Carter selection process as well. So to be selected for a zone, Carters will submit bids to the city. The bids will be weighed on compliance with a set of rules and standards, including providing regular and affordable organics and recycling services, safety standards, standards of fairness to establishments, and we are hopeful worker standards and wage rate floors. So the law passed last fall, and now we're in the rollout and implementation phase. And our goal is making sure EJ standards and worker justice standards are prioritized at this point in the process too. So for workers, we want to see responsible rate floor to ensure that workers are fairly compensated, and robust PPE training, safety standards to ensure they're protected on the job. And our partners at Teamsters Joint Council 16 are helping us lead this fight and make sure that workers are protected. And we're also, wanting to see the needs of environmental justice communities of color that have faced environmental racism and air pollution for years prioritized as well. So 2/3 of city waste is processed at waste transfer stations in 3 communities of color in the South Bronx, North Bronx, and Southeast Queens. And a study by local activists counted that as many as 150 commercial waste trucks passed hourly pass through just one South Bronx intersection. So, we still want to see transfer station conditions, compliance with local, state, and federal laws as they relate to health and safety to avoid facilities, nuisances in communities of color, such as truck idling, smells, rodents, and even community intimidation. We want to see reduced vehicle miles traveled and associated air pollution and greenhouse gases emissions limited. And we want to see expansion of microhauling as a sustainable alternative to traditional hauling, employing women, non-binary people, and youth of color, and the use of marine and rail for export as opposed to long haul trucking. It's a better alternative while we develop more ways to localize waste processing. And our partners at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance are helping us lead this work with environmental justice communities as well. We're also fighting to make sure DSNY has the funding they need in the city budget for the program to be implemented in full and on time this year. And this fight is ongoing. We need our next mayor and members of city council to be committed to continued implementation of commercial waste zones with high road standards for workers and protections for environmental justice communities as we move forward. Thanks.
Phoebe, thank you so much. Okay, we have a few questions, and this is an opportunity to remind folks that if you have more questions, please drop them in the Q&A. The first question we have is asking about the fact that we have a lot of fast food stores, coffee shops, etc., that they have separate slots for recycling, composting, and waste. And there's a concern that customers simply throw trash in any random slot, and that may result in everything going to trash as opposed to being, managed properly. So realistically, what can be done to improve this? So I think Bridget, this is like a good one for you to start on.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm nodding in recognition because we do struggle in our outreach efforts to figure out how to solve for customer behavior, set up waste management stations in front of house that are conducive to getting the separation that we need. But we can't forget there's also a lot of material that's produced back of house. So where food prep is happening, there's a significant amount of food waste that is already ready to be separated and beneficially collected and reused. It's also the choices that are made in terms of what types of material are set out and allowed to be used for customers. I think Eric mentioned there's a bill related to opting into certain single-use items in a restaurant. If you have to ask for a straw, how often would you use straws as often? Things like that. Ways to naturally reduce the amount of discards that are happening. But it is a challenge, and it's something that we're continuing to try to solve for in terms of outreach and incentives. But it's a tough one.
Eric or Phoebe, do you want to add to that, or?
I'll just add one thing that, as Bridget said, there's a lot of potential for recycling in the back of the restaurant, in the kitchen, and that is oftentimes easier to implement. In the front of restaurants, one of the major problems is that every restaurant seems to label its recycling differently. There's not uniformity in signage or in containers. This is really a problem around the nation. There is now some federal legislation that would begin to set standards for uniform recycling signage and containers. So at least the educational process would begin. I'm afraid there's no easy answer, but obviously the clearer we could make the signage and the containers, the easier it will be for people to recycle. It's a challenge.
It is, and I'll just add to that in New York, for example, waste management is handled at the local level. So what's recyclable in New York City may not be the same in Long Island, in Westchester, in Albany, because it is managed by the municipalities and not by the state of New York, by state law. So that is a challenge, and that is something that makes it a little bit more complicated. And I think, consistently having the same materials be recyclable also will make that easier. So like when we had to step back on recycling, compost food waste, that does sort of impact people's ability to sort of get it in their brains. And of course, when I was at the State Department of Environmental Conservation, we always like to target education to fourth graders, because they were sort of smart enough to get it, and they were young enough to care about it, and they were pushy enough to bring it home to their parents.
Very important point.
Yes. The next question wait, before I go on, Phoebe, did you want to add anything as well? Okay, just wanted to check. Another question is if there are any waste to energy plants in the New York City area.
Yes, in the greater, not within New York City boundaries, but within the greater New York City area. So Newark, Essex County in New Jersey, and as Eric mentioned, upstate New York. A large portion of Manhattan's waste goes to waste energy.
Eric, I think this is a question for you about straws. What is the question is, what is the response for straws for persons with disabilities? Is there anything further in the bill? There's a concern that expecting people to ask for them is not sufficient, but I know there's been a lot of discussion about that.
There has been, and the disability community rightly raised some questions when that bill was first introduced. There have been changes that have been negotiated by the bill's sponsor and the council with the disability community. So I think the long and the short of it is now that there have been provisions added to the bill to ensure that anyone who needs a straw can have access to it in a restaurant without having to go to any great difficulty, because I think it was never the intent of the bill sponsors, and certainly not the intent of environmental folks who were supporting this, to make the life of anyone in the disability community any more difficult than it already is.
Anybody have anything else to add?
No, I would agree. There was a very productive back and forth and conversation about how does the language in the bill get adjusted to make sure that those issues are being accounted for.
Great. Someone is asking that they said they only heard 50% of recyclables end up in the waste stream. What are the barriers to getting more recyclables?
I think one of the main things, sorry, my toddler just came in, apologies. One of the things that we talk a lot about, so education. And we have, for a city of 8.6 million people, we have a fairly limited education staff, so we do as much as we can. But there are some structural barriers to recycling. And so we have old building stock where there's not sufficient storage space. It may not be conducive to make recycling easy. I would recommend reviewing a document called the Zero Waste Design Guidelines, and it was put together by a group of architects and stakeholders about how do you create the built environment to be more conducive and easy for source separation recycling. So where can you put a bin so that it's easy to find, easy to access? Do you have sufficient storage in that built environment? Do you have access for the trucks to get in and collect that material separately? So there's a lot of urban planning that needs to go into place to help us improve our capture rates.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I would just say that we can and should do better. We have a lot of people, there are a lot of challenges. We have a lot of people moving into the city and out of the city. We have people who speak dozens and dozens of different languages. We have to have educational information available to them on a continuing basis. And certainly in places like the New York City Housing Authority developments, we must do a better job of making recycling convenient to those residents who care about the environment and care about their local living conditions as much as anyone, and would like to recycle, but haven't had the opportunity to. So they've got a lot of challenges at NYCHA, but certainly one of them is better waste handling and making recycling more convenient.
Why is the city not conducting random inspections to ensure businesses are actually following recycling guidelines?
We do enforce recycling. We also force composting for the businesses that are required by law to do so. I think it's really an issue of trade-offs. So we have an enforcement staff, and which things are we prioritizing for enforcement? So we don't get everywhere all the time. And so one of the questions is always just want a priority. And so elected officials can help us set those priorities. Do we want to prioritize enforcement around business recycling and composting, or with limited resources, or should we put our enforcement focus elsewhere? But we do have a dedicated team, a small dedicated team related to business recycling.
What are the root causes that stop all of these important regulations from being implemented, enforced, and funded? The question is it a relationship with organization and city agencies with communities? Is it public adoption? Is it messaging or marketing to New Yorkers? Is it a lack of funding from the city or the state or federal government?
Probably a combination of all of those things. Certainly, funding is an issue. Again, if you look at these issues with a broad lens over the long term, not only from an environmental perspective, but from an economic perspective, recycling pays, and so does composting. And that's because there are two costs to waste handling. I won't get into this in too much detail, although you can always email me at goldstein@nrtc.org. But one of the costs, there's the cost of collecting the waste, and there's the cost of disposing of the waste. And again, it costs more to take waste to an incinerator or a landfill than it does to a recycling facility or a composting facility. And by the way, recycling and composting facilities have more jobs, green jobs, good jobs, blue collar jobs per ton of waste than do incinerators or landfills. So if we want to create jobs for people and New Yorkers, if we want to cut over time our ever-growing costs of waste disposal, we need to make this conversion to a system that relies more on sustainable practices like recycling and composting. The transition is difficult. The transition is expensive. There are a lot of competing priorities, but that's what we need to do. That's one of the jobs of the council, is to plan for a better New York over the long term.
And I would say, you know, the commercial waste zones is an example where the part of the fee for winning a contract in a geographic zone is to pay for the administrative costs for the city to operate, to oversee this program and ensure this program is run properly. The extended producer responsibility law that's currently at the state is an example of trying to find other monies besides city taxpayer money to help fund these programs. And so we're really pushing on those things to help our money go farther as a city. I will say we have passed extended producer responsibility at the city level for certain products as well. So a perfect example of that is the refrigerant laws. So CFC containing devices like your air conditioners and your refrigerators, when we get called to pick up, to empty the CFCs and pick up those items, we actually tag it and we charge the producer of that item, the manufacturer of that item, for our work. So there are ways that we can try to do more and reduce the taxpayer burden, but it's not everything.
Yeah, and I think just to add, I think Eric mentioned this as well, but you know, folks don't necessarily think of addressing these issues as like green job creation paths, but they are. And I think a lot of this is about raising consciousness about this and educating folks. And, you know, these aren't some of the necessarily issues that folks point to in terms of reducing emissions on a large scale, but they are huge pathways to creating green jobs and setting us on the pathway to emissions reductions, especially in New York City.
Great. I'm trying to figure out how to consolidate some of those questions. What are the potential economic development impacts of universal composting?
So a curbside composting program, we will we estimate we have close to 1 million tons a year of organics suitable for composting to be generated. So that's going to involve facilities who do composting to be built, to be expanded. We are trying to site those types of facilities and to work with facilities that are as close to New York City as possible so that those jobs are reflected in New York City. On the business sector side, we think it's another 650,000 tons of food waste. There are many, many industries that are building up already as we speak, consulting with businesses on how do they reduce their food waste? How do they save money by reducing the amount of food that gets wasted? There are refrigerators. There's many types of products that are also being purchased and used to help manage food waste and keep it for whether it's donation or reuse, et cetera. So I don't know that we have any one number, but happy to chat about that more.
And this is an opportunity to work with DEP as well, because the wastewater treatment plants manage sewage sludge through anaerobic digesters, and they can also be taking in food waste as they are doing at the Newtown Creek facility in Brooklyn, which is very cool. And for some strange reason, it's a hot place to go to on Valentine's Day. I don't know why. I don't know the history of that. I'm relatively new to New York City, but it makes me laugh. But there are definitely opportunities for other uses of compost and things like that as well.
And I would just also add that the community scale composting is something that when you recycle, it's really difficult to recycle locally, but composting is something you can do locally. You can take the food scraps, process it in your neighborhood, and it turns actually right there into the compost that you'd use on your parks and your gardens, on your street trees. So there are micro haulers, micro businesses and nonprofits that are also popping up to help to right now fill the gap, but also there should be a role for them moving forward too, to keep the community scale efforts going as well.
I'm going to combine these two questions, but one question is about New York City schools using single-use forks and spoons, and I don't know if the mayor's executive order addresses that. And then the second quasi-related question is that food courts in our culture, even when they're government run, are often relying on single-use disposable everything, plates, forks, bags, garbage, as opposed to using real dishes and washing them. So is there an opportunity to, in both of those cases, reduce the amount of waste that we're generating by moving to reusable?
The answer is yes, there are opportunities. And the question is how one incentivizes the businesses to make those shifts. New York City school system for years and years used 800,000 polystyrene foam trays for student lunches. And they wanted to get rid of every day. Yes. And because we have almost 1 million students. And so they wanted to make the switch, but the alternatives were a little more expensive. So they banded together with 7 other major cities' school systems and were able to get a purchase order from a United States company in Maine to make compostable trays at virtually the same cost as the old polystyrene toxic trays. And so that's an area where getting together, businesses use their purchasing power to get the costs equivalent. Similar things can be taken on, but there needs to be a will, and oftentimes there needs to be an incentive, or at least removal of disincentives. We hope that the council can do that by making utensils available only on request. That saves businesses money, and that's the kind of thing that we ought to see more of.
The DOE has a multi-city alliance for procurement. And so in addition to these compostable plates, they have purchased compostable cutlery. So it's still single use, which is not ideal, but we worked with them to make sure that it was certified compostable, that it would break down properly. We tested them in our composting facility. So for schools that have the brown bin program, when it's not suspended, that's cutlery that doesn't have to be separated. It can just go right in with the food waste and it will break down. So we're trying to find little ways to make the system that exists more sustainable. Part of the challenge, I think, with reusables are, at least within the public schools, is that a lot of the dishwashers have gone away. So it's possible to do, but there's an investment that has to happen to bring back dishwashers and the people who are working those dishwashers. And momentum went the other direction. Doesn't mean we can't turn it back, but it would take a regulatory action.
Or a real commitment to sustainability. So there's opportunities there for sure on multiple fronts. So a question is, one of the challenges of the organics collection program was language access. Are there plans for equitable outreach and community engagement for when the program is restored?
Yes, absolutely. We have 10 languages that we, everything gets printed into, so any print piece. And we had a language access line, which is not ideal. So we had about 5 different languages on the outreach team that had been hired for the rollout. But obviously that's not every language in the city. And so we did have the opportunity for people to call in somebody who did speak the language, but it can be awkward to do it that way. So our priority definitely would be to have more people in person speaking the languages in the neighborhoods. And we simply needed more people too. We can't underscore the need for education to roll out a program like this.
That's something that our organization and many environmental organizations have been asking for, more funding for the Department of Sanitation to do more education, because we know how important that is. It really does. It takes a while to get people to change. People don't like to change. And so it takes a lot of education to make that happen.
And our education budget has been completely cut.
Yeah.
And
the state doesn't have that much money for that either, unfortunately. The question is, can we say more about the waste processing facilities in the city? The question is which ones are better than others, but I think it might perhaps be a little bit more useful to talk about sort of how many there are. If we have an idea of public versus private. We talked a little bit about equity, but we didn't really describe what that sort of turned into, how that sort of has transitioned over time. So that might be a more fulsome way of answering that question.
I'm happy to start. The good news is that incinerators are no longer around in New York City. Some of us of a certain age remember when there were as many as 18 municipal incinerators around and several thousand apartment buildings. And in the 1950s, apartment buildings that were being built were required to have apartment house incinerators. They had no pollution controls. They were horrible toxic sources of localized pollution. All of those have been shut down by council action. So there's no garbage burning in New York City, although, as Bridget said, a lot of our trash, at least from Manhattan, is burned in the Essex County incinerator in Newark, and prevailing winds often bring that air pollution right back into New York City, let alone impacting the environmental justice community surrounding it. There is a modern recycling facility. All of our metal, glass, and plastics are handled by the Sims Recycling Facility, Sunset Park in Brooklyn. Much of our paper is handled by the Pratt Industries paper recycling plant on Staten Island. The real problem, however, that's everything I've just talked about is residential waste. And the real problem is with commercial waste, where it's handled by land-based transfer stations that are primarily located in 3 communities of color: the South Bronx, North Brooklyn, and Southeast Queens. Those communities get an unfair share of the burden. Diesel trucks going in at all hours of the day and night, trash often strewn on the streets, odors wafting out of the facilities. They're poorly run, and that's exactly why, as Phoebe said, there is legislation that was just passed last year that would completely revamp and reform the commercial waste system and set up, with DSNY in charge, a system of zoned contracts where there would be no more than 3 carters per zone. But that statute is not self-enforcing. And over the next several years, it will be very critical that the council watch that. It's probably the most significant solid waste law reform passed in 20 years in New York City. And implementing it is going to be critical.
Agreed. And I think one thing that we're also looking at, so we have the recycling facility in Brooklyn, we have our paper recycling facility on Staten Island. And that's the happy story, where it's not only recycling, doesn't only take our recyclables, it actually is a paper mill and creates new paper products. And we have a series of transfer stations for recyclables set around the city, and we do move the material by barge where possible. So it's taking trucks off the road. And then for composting, we have a city-run composting facility on Staten Island that takes a significant amount of yard waste, and also has taken some of our food waste when we have those programs running. We have a system on Rikers Island where we actually compost all of the food waste from the island and keep the compost there for greening projects on the island with the inmates. And then we contract with regional composters around the region. Our new sort of venture, which we're very excited about, as Julie mentioned, is to partner with Department of Environmental Protection to deliver food waste as a bioslurry to the DEP wastewater treatment plants to see if we can generate renewable energy from food waste. So there's a number of different beneficial use projects, and we have to have that DEP infrastructure anyway, so we may as well leverage it for 2 different reasons. So we're trying to be efficient with siting of facilities and leveraging facilities if we can.
Bridget's comment reminded me of the importance of mentioning the Renewable Rikers program. As many of you know, there are ongoing efforts to close down Rikers as a jail, both for social justice and other moral reasons. And the question is how best Rikers Island can be reused. There's a proposal being advanced by Costa Constantinides and other members of the council with strong support from the environmental and environmental justice communities that would transform Rikers from an island of shame into a showplace of sustainability by making that island a place for composting facilities, solar energy and energy storage, so we could shut down some of the oldest peaker plants that are polluting some of our neighborhoods, and a new modern wastewater treatment plant. That will certainly be an issue for the council to deal with, not only this coming week, but in the months ahead.
Great. Thank you all so much. That does conclude the time we have for questions on this panel. I want to thank Bridget, Eric, and Phoebe for your presentations and for answering all these questions today. I also would like to take a minute, since I failed to do this earlier. We have a short poll for you to answer. We want to know a bit about what your constituents care about. So I think, there we go. We're going to run the poll right now. It should be very pretty brief. And then we will give us just a minute and we will start the next panel. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Eric. There's always more to do on waste management, folks. Our next panel is on building emissions. One of the most important steps we can take to combat climate change is to reduce emissions from buildings, which is the #1 contributor of climate pollution in New York City, unlike in the state where it's transportation. To address this, New York City Council passed Local Law 97 in 2019, which will require certain large buildings to meet emission reduction standards. We recently held a webinar on reducing emissions from the building sector as part of our series on meeting the statewide climate leadership and community protection act goals. We talked about the wide variety of challenges amongst buildings in the city. We have an entire cohort of commercial buildings that demand huge amounts of electricity during the weekdays, but stay empty at nights and on weekends, or at least that's how the city operates during normal times. The highly dense apartment buildings, which may still use old HVAC systems, also have vastly different types of energy needs than small houses that can upgrade their systems more easily. Tonight, we'll talk more about these challenges and policies to address them. Our first panelist is Adam Roberts. Adam manages policy and advocacy efforts for the American Institute of Architects, New York. He previously worked as a political aide, fundraiser, and documentary producer. Adam has a bachelor's and master's degrees from Johns Hopkins and Columbia, respectively, both in political science. And Adam, to start.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks to LCV for having me. I'm Adam Roberts. I'm the Director of Policy for AIA New York, which is the American Institute of Architects, New York. We're the trade association which represents New York's public and private sector architects. So we can go to the next slide. So Local Law 97, also known as the Climate Mobilization Act, is something which is meant to encourage retrofitting. And we'll talk more about other things it's meant to do in a bit, but you're often hearing about the term retrofitting and this being the retrofitting law. So what is retrofitting? Retrofitting just means physically changing an existing building. It's reusing something that already exists, and it doesn't just have to be a building. But in this case, we are talking about reusing existing buildings to improve their energy efficiency, because the greenest building is always the building that exists. That's a term that people say a lot. So how do you do it? We're just talking about better insulating or weathering buildings to improve their heating and cooling efficiency. And so this means adding or improving to the facade, windows, doors, also replacing or improving heating and cooling systems. So that means temperature controls, timers, and electrification, which is improving the source of energy. We're assuming that wherever we're getting our power from is going to be cleaner than where it is now. And so why retrofit? Why are cities like New York talking about doing this? And it's pretty simple. It's just because in most large cities, or even smaller cities, the bulk of carbon emissions are coming from buildings. And in New York, because we are a good city that doesn't drive everywhere, transportation is often in other places where much of carbon emissions is coming from. 70% of our carbon emissions are coming from buildings. So if we are ever to do things like follow through with the Paris Climate Accords, we need to make sure we retrofit our existing buildings and bring those emissions down. We go to the next slide. So certifications and ratings. This is another thing that I think a lot of candidates don't fully understand, but you hear these terms thrown about. There are a lot of certifications and ratings for sustainable design. And I'll just run through a few of these very quickly. One of them is Passive House, which is a method of doing sustainable design through passive measures. So I list a few of them there, but I think the one you really want to focus on is airtightness. Passive house design is meant to keep a home particularly well insulated. And Passive House is a design method which comes out of Germany, and in the US is run by something called the Passive House Institute. In New York, there's an organization called New York Passive House. And what Passive House does, in addition to it just being a design method, is the organization will give a certification to people who take their courses and become experts in it, and that's called being a certified passive house consultant. CHPC is for short. And you may see when interacting with people who are work in design or construction that they'll have CHPC, or in a second we'll get to LEED AP after their names. That's all it means. It's just that they took some courses and they're now an expert in that design method. Next is LEED. This is probably the most famous one. And this is just a method for rating buildings across a number of different sustainable design categories. And some of them get very specific. Like, for instance, there's LEED for how bird-friendly glass is. Does glass stop birds from hitting into it? So LEED covers much more than strictly making a building energy efficient. But as far as efficiency goes, there are 4 LEED ratings. There's LEED certified, silver, gold, or platinum, and you often see these in like a building's lobby promoting how green it is. And this is run by the U.S. Green Building Council, USGBC for short. And in our local in New York, it's called Urban Green, and you'll be hearing from them in a bit. And someone who is an expert in LEED design is known as LEED accredited professional, LEED AP. But again, LEED is not like Passive House, a specific design method. Passive House is a specific design method. LEED is just a group of various sustainable design methods. And last is Energy Star. Energy Star is just a government-backed symbol for energy efficiency that doesn't even have to do with just like building materials and things like that. Like you often see it on appliances. So it's just showing how energy efficient something is and saying that the government has rated it as being particularly energy efficient. And that's run by the EPA. But I will add that for buildings, LEED does have specific, sorry, not LEED, Energy Star does have specific ratings, and those are actually those letter grades and the numbers that you've been seeing on buildings pop up, but I'll talk about that more in a second. So we can go to the next slide. So prior legislation. So what came before Local Law 97? Local Law 97 didn't come out of thin air. It was something that had been discussed for many, many years or something like it. There had been proposals during the Bloomberg administration to have some sort of mandatory retrofitting law like Local Law 97. The real estate industry was able to convince elected officials at the time that that they thought that mandates alone, that mandates weren't necessary to require us to reduce our carbon emissions significantly, that just incentives or slight nudges would be enough to do that, and unfortunately they weren't. So that's how we ended up with Local Law 97. But 2 important laws came out of that initial effort during the Bloomberg era. One was Local Law 84, which requires benchmarking, which means just that buildings over 10,000 square feet need to submit their energy and water usage to the city in the form of Energy Star scores. And then those are made publicly available. Local Law 87 requires energy audits and retro-commissioning. So just the submission of audits reports to the city. And then retro-commissioning just means making some improved efficiency of existing systems within a building, not requiring a full retrofit. And then more recently, right before Local Law 97 was Local Law 33, which requires the posting of energy grades that include both numerical Energy Star grade and then a corresponding letter grade, which the city created. And that's what's on the right there and what you've seen popping up in buildings throughout the city. So that's currently being enforced right now. We can go to the next slide. So Local Law 97's purpose, there are actually a few purposes for it. And the overarching desire was to spur retrofitting of large buildings. But why was that good besides just reducing carbon emissions? Well, in that lane, one was just making sure we comply with the Paris Climate Accord, which is crucial. Another is to generate green jobs, and this is really, really important. this law is one of the most important job creators in the design and construction industry since the New Deal. This will create billions and billions and billions of dollars in work. Also reducing inequality in living and working conditions. Many of us in New York are used to steam heat and a lack of thermostats and things like that. But that's not normal in most developed countries. You would normally have a thermostat. You would be able to control the temperature in your home. And last, reducing pollution and improving air quality. Can we go to the next slide? So provisions, really quickly running through these. So buildings over 25,000 square feet need to stay under carbon emissions limits. There are fines when you exceed those limits. There's reporting that's required to be done by architects and engineers. There are also alternative means of compliance for certain types of buildings, and there are exemptions and variances, which again need to be proved by an architect or engineer. You can't just say, oh, I don't want to do this and get away with it. You will have to prove that there are reasons you can't comply. And then lastly, creating a new office within the Department of Buildings. This is the Office of Building, Energy and Emissions Performance, and also an advisory board that will work with the Department of Buildings that's composed of volunteers, and they will help to oversee enforcement and further define provisions. So you go to the next slide. So what's missing in Local Law 97? First is specific design mandates. For the most part, there are two small buts to this. One is that there were some design mandates passed at the same time in Local Law 9294, which requires green roofs and solar panels. Also, some buildings which can't comply for a number of reasons have to make specific design changes. Buildings under 25,000 square feet weren't included. Such a huge part of the city. Embodied carbon, which is a carbon emitted to create materials and products. Buildings with rent stabilized units, though this was later resolved for the most part. And then requirements for building inspections and report auditing. It's not specified how exactly this will be enforced, which is a bit concerning. And so now we can go to the last slide and just talk about your role. So what do you as future council members need to do to enforce this? First is adequately fund the office that's actually overseeing this right now. It's just a handful of people who are going to oversee the enforcement of this enormous piece of legislation. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of the largest buildings in New York being overseen by like 7 people right now. It's really terrifying to think about, and it frankly won't work if you only have a handful of people overseeing this, not to mention the fact they can't even educate building owners on it. Second is maintaining those mandates. There's already a law passed which unfortunately eased compliance with Local Law 97. Expanding covered buildings. So fortunately, there was also another law passed last year, which increased the amount of buildings who are complying with Local Law 97. And then the last thing is managing OBEEP, that office within DOB, and the advisory board, because they're going to have to report their recommendations to the council in 2023. And so it's really important that you make sure that their recommendations keep Local Law 97 robust and especially enforceable. And that's about it for now. I'll pass it to the next person.
Thank you so much. It was a very robust review. Our next panelist is Chris Halfnight. Chris is the Associate Director of Policy at Urban Green Council, where he leads efforts to advance energy efficiency and building decarbonization in New York City and New York State. Chris co-led Urban Green's 40-member convening to help shape Local Law 97, and he's now on one of the city's climate working groups to guide implementation. Chris also leads Urban Green's work to advance carbon trading for buildings. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Julie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Halfnight. As Julie said, I lead policy work at Urban Green Council. Next slide, please. Urban Green is a nonprofit focused on transforming buildings for a sustainable future in New York City and around the world. Next slide, please. We advance that mission through 4 key functions. The first is we convene a wide range of stakeholders to help identify barriers and fashion policy solutions. Second, we research building technology, building energy, and carbon data to help inform policy making. Third, we develop and advocate policy change with city and state policymakers. And fourth, actually our largest function is we educate architects, engineers, building operators, plumbers, electricians, and other trades professionals on green building practices. Next slide, please. We do all this because buildings matter, and in New York City, they matter a great deal. You heard from Adam, 2/3 or nearly 70% of New York City's carbon pollution comes from the energy used in buildings. So we simply won't get to our long-term climate goals without decarbonizing buildings. Next slide. The good news is we're making some progress. So for several years, Urban Green has published an annual report on energy and water use in the city's large buildings. That's the benchmarking report. Adam mentioned the benchmarking law. So that is from, that's data from buildings over 25,000 square feet. As a rough measure, that's about a 25-unit apartment building. That's the size. So this graph is from our latest version of the report, which is a look back at 10 years of data that we now have to help us understand what's happening in these large buildings. And as you can see here, this is a big drop. It's a 23% drop in emissions in that large building set from 2010 to today, or to last year. So that's a major improvement, and it's cause for celebration. About 60% of that improvement has come from the buildings themselves, so energy efficiency on site, or transitioning a system from oil to natural gas for the most part. And then about 40% of those improvements have come from improvements at the power plant level for the power plants that supply electricity to New York City. So we're making some progress towards the city's commitment to 80% reductions by 2050, but there's no doubt we have a long way to go. And I'm going to quickly highlight 4 key priorities for Urban Green to help get us there. Next slide, please. The first is building electrification. So over 40% of New York City's total carbon emissions come from burning fossil fuels for heat and hot water in buildings. Over 40%. It's enormous. Over the next 30 years, we need to transition most or all of those buildings off of fossil fuel boilers to high efficiency electric heat pumps that can tap in to a cleaner grid. That's building electrification. It's a major transition. One key strategy is for new construction. We need to update the building codes to require all electric construction, so we're not putting more stranded fossil fuel assets in buildings. But the bigger challenge by far is the existing buildings. Roughly 85% of the buildings that we'll have in 2050 are already built today. So we need to do deep retrofits in those buildings over the next 20 or 30 years to transition them off fossil fuels. Urban Green released a report shown on the slide here last April. It's on our website. I encourage you to check it out. It has a deep dive on this issue, including on the technology and the challenges and barriers, and then also some recommendations on next steps to jumpstart progress. Next slide, please. A second major priority is successfully implementing Local Law 97. You heard about this from Adam. Getting this law passed was a huge feat. It's a major step forward for New York City, but we still have a lot of work to do. There's 4 key items that I flagged on the slide here that we're focused on in implementing Local Law 97. Number 1, to echo what Adam said, we need funding to continue and to increase for the Department of Buildings office that is tasked with figuring out a lot of the law's details. So we're in constrained budget times, but this is an investment that's relatively small and will pay back many times over in more successful compliance. And that means more local energy efficiency, more green jobs, better buildings for New Yorkers. Second, the metric that's at the heart of Local Law 97 measures how much carbon a building emits. It's carbon per square foot. We need to refine that metric to make sure that it's not penalizing density or more people in a space. That's particularly important because lower and more moderate income housing tends to be more dense, and we don't want the law to penalize that. Third, Local Law 97 can operate as a lever to incentivize electrification. It can send a stronger signal or a weaker signal, and we want to make sure the mechanics of the law are sending a strong signal that building owners over time should be converting off of fossil fuels. And then fourth, we need a major ramp up in the education, outreach, and support that matches the deep challenges in achieving the objectives of this law. Next slide, please. Another priority for Urban Green Council under the Local Law 97 umbrella is advancing a program that allows carbon trading for buildings. So this means allowing a building that reduces carbon below its target to sell those extra savings to a building that is struggling to meet its target in a given year. In the image here, we have building B. It's 3 units over its carbon cap, represented by those 3 gray circles. Maybe that's because it's waiting for a year or two to access lower cost financing when it goes through a refinancing. Maybe there's equipment in the building that's not yet up for replacement, and in a couple of years, it will be more cost effective to upgrade that building. On the other hand, we have building A that has just implemented a retrofit and reduced its emissions 3 units below its cap, represented by the 3 white circles, the empty circles. Those are credits for carbon savings. So trading would allow building A to sell those credits, those excess savings, to building B. Both would then be in compliance, and building A would have extra revenue to pay off its investment or to invest again in new upgrades. That's the concept. Next slide, please. But why do we need trading? There are a number of different reasons, and I'll just touch on them briefly. So Local Law 97 leaves many buildings behind, including many types of affordable housing, and trading opens up a new source of funds that can help. So there are concerns about the potential for a market-based trading program to negatively affect disadvantaged communities. Those are real concerns, and they need to be addressed through engagement and program design. We've been focused on that, and we think program design can be structured to drive investment with guardrails. So for example, credits could only be purchased from New York City Housing Authority buildings. So they're guaranteed investment and savings coming from buildings where we want to see the money flow. Second, trading provides flexibility to building owners. Building owners, buildings use energy for many different reasons. Some are open 24 hours. Some have very intense energy uses like data centers or TV production studios. Trading gives some flexibility for that great variety, and it also means a lower cost of compliance overall to hit the same carbon reductions. Most importantly though, trading means providing that flexibility while driving energy efficiency in New York City buildings and not fines. Some buildings are going to struggle to meet their caps no matter what, and they'll face a fine, and they should. If they're above the cap, that's the way the law works. But every dollar that goes to a penalty revenue is a dollar that isn't spent on energy efficiency in New York City buildings. And trading allows the law to channel that money instead to local energy savings, local jobs in design and construction, and then local benefits, co-benefits like health, comfort, and air quality. Next slide, please. One final priority on the next slide. The slide doesn't seem to be advancing, but I have there's another slide highlighting a final priority, which is the other 1 million buildings. So Adam touched on this, that Local Law 97 is buildings over 25,000 square feet. The buildings below that threshold are 95% by total number, 40% by total area, and a third of city-wide emissions, total emissions, including transportation. So it's an enormous sector, and there are many different challenges to addressing emissions in that sector, but we need to find a way. So that's an area for future policy development. And then on the last slide, which I'm not sure if it's going to show here, I have my contact information and would be happy to provide any additional information that's helpful to you all.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure what's happening with the slides right now, so hopefully that will get fixed shortly. Hopefully staff we're working on that. But thank you very much, Chris, for that presentation. Our next panelist is Donna DiCostanza. Donna is the Eastern Regional Director for the Climate and Clean Energy Program at the NRDC, where she advocates for the adoption of policies and initiatives that tackle climate pollution and increase energy efficiency, renewable energy deployment, and clean transportation in the Eastern United States. Prior to NRDC, Donna was counsel to the New York City's Council, the Council's Committee on Environmental Protection, where she advised the Speaker and Council members on environmental policy and crafted legislation on various issues, including sustainability planning, climate change, clean energy, air and water quality, and green procurement. So Donna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and good evening, everybody. It is great to be with you all tonight. Hope everyone is doing well. As Julie mentioned, I'm Eastern Regional Director in the Climate and Clean Energy Program at the NRDC. So you heard from my wonderful colleague, Eric Goldstein, earlier on the waste panel. And I'll be echoing many of the same themes as Chris and Adam, the importance of energy efficiency and electrification, but we'll also talk about the relationship between what happens in New York City and at the state level. So as my colleagues have already talked about, Local Law 97 builds upon New York City's already impressive and extensive history of reducing energy consumption in buildings and tackling climate change. And that law and all the building initiatives implemented by New York City not only result in significant local benefits, but they also serve as really important examples and models for other cities around the country. Cities like New York have an incredibly important role in tackling climate change. And even with a federal administration in place as we have now that's made fighting climate change a priority, it's critical that cities and states still lead on this issue. And they really have been with New York City in front for a long time. Cities have important levers they can use to reduce emissions associated with buildings with more stringent building codes and requirements, code enforcement, zoning codes, et cetera. And we really do need all hands on deck and action at all levels of government if we're going to get to where we need to be on climate. So New York City's leadership has been and will continue to be really important. So just really want to stress New York City's role on the national stage on this issue in particular. You can go to the next slide, please. So New York City's actions on buildings are not only key to meeting the city's climate goals, but will also play an important role in the state's achievement of its ambitious greenhouse gas reduction and energy efficiency and other targets. As Julie mentioned earlier, in 2019, we not only had a really big year in New York City with Local Law 97 and the Climate Mobilization Act, but the state also adopted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA. So that law is the most aggressive state climate law in the country, with a number of very ambitious mandates that will require us to take deep decarbonization measures over the next 30 years to reach 85% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2050 and carbon neutrality as well. There are also specific aggressive energy efficiency and renewables targets codified in the law that help to ensure that buildings statewide save energy and that our grid becomes increasingly cleaner, becoming 100% clean or carbon-free statewide by 2040. And importantly, the law also includes critical equity provisions, including a requirement that 35 to 40% of the benefits of the state's clean energy programs go to disadvantaged communities. And with the CLCPA on energy efficiency specifically, we're required to triple where we are today. So very aggressive targets, and Local Law 97 will play a big role in helping to achieve those. To ensure we achieve the goal, the energy efficiency goal that the state has outlined, each utility in the state, like Con Edison, for example, is required by the New York State Public Service Commission, or the PSC, to achieve a certain level of energy savings in their service territories. And to meet those targets, Con Edison and other utilities develop various programs, including incentives and other assistance, such as rebates for more efficient equipment, to help people make their homes and buildings more energy efficient. The state also has an energy authority called the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, which is charged with helping the state to transition to a clean energy economy, advancing clean energy solutions, including greater energy efficiency and electrification. And NYSERDA does many things on that front, but a big role that it has is helping to transform the market to ensure that clean energy technologies, including those related to building decarbonization, become more affordable and readily available. Right now, NYSERDA is working to develop state roadmaps to ensure we achieve carbon neutral buildings and wide-scale statewide building electrification. There's also a body called the Climate Action Council, which is made up of appointed state agency representatives and stakeholders that's working to develop a scoping plan with recommendations for achieving the clean energy and climate targets included in the CLCPA, so the state's climate law, including the energy efficiency target. There are also associated advisory panels, one focused on building decarbonization called the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel, that's in the process of developing their recommendations for the building sector, which will impact what happens in buildings in New York City and across the state. So it's really critical that the city and the state's efforts are integrated and complementary, and that they're working together to meet the goals that we're all trying to achieve. And as I mentioned, Local Law 97 will play a big role in helping the state to achieve its targets, particularly since New York City makes up a significant portion of New York State's electric load. And vice versa, state programs and initiatives, those of NYSERDA and what's required of the utilities, are critical for ensuring that New York City building owners and tenants, particularly of affordable multifamily housing, have the assistance they need to achieve greater energy savings and to electrify their buildings as well. So these state and utility efforts need to work together with the city's own efforts to make sure that the resources and education are in place to ensure building owners have the tools that they need to comply, and that implementation of the law, Local Law 97 in particular, is as successful as possible. So I think Chris mentioned this before, there needs to be extensive outreach about the requirements that exist and really about how building owners can comply, and in particular, how they can upgrade their buildings to make them as energy efficient as possible. Can you switch to the next slide, please? In addition to the state and utility programs, the city has an initiative that will help with compliance known as the Retrofit Accelerator, which is a free program that offers advisory services to help building owners successfully complete energy efficiency projects. It basically walks building owners through the process of doing energy efficiency upgrades, helping with contractors, making sure folks are connected with available incentives, financing, basically all of the puzzle pieces that are needed to make the process of upgrading a building to be more energy efficient as smooth as possible. And the city is currently working to scale up that program to meet the magnitude of Local Law 97. So it's really critical, as both Adam and Chris mentioned, that the DOB and the city more generally have the funding and the resources that they need to implement Local Law 97 and the city's entire building decarbonization framework. The passage of Local Law 97 was a huge accomplishment, but implementation is really key, and ensuring that we're achieving the needed carbon reductions and all of the other local benefits that brings. And energy efficiency, as was already mentioned, brings big benefits beyond the reduction of carbon emissions. It's the easiest, fastest way to tackle climate change while also creating good quality jobs, local jobs. It helps to reduce stress on the grid and increase our resiliency. And it reduces the need for greater investment in additional energy infrastructure. So saving money there, as well as lowering New Yorkers' utility bills, ensuring more tenant comfort, and reducing other harmful pollution in addition to carbon emissions. So I really can't stress enough how important energy efficiency is, and that we continue to focus on it, even though it's not something that's specifically required in Local Law 97, it's something that needs to remain a priority. So I mentioned the job creation benefits of energy efficiency, which holds true for electrification as well. NRDC's affiliate, Environmental Entrepreneurs, completed a Clean Jobs America report last year that showed New York City is the leading metropolitan area in the country with respect to the creation of clean energy jobs, many of which come from building decarbonization. So in particular, energy efficiency, electrification. So these things moving in this direction can really play a role in the city's economic recovery from the pandemic. The building decarb jobs are jobs that can't be outsourced, and they've shown significant gains over the last several years as we move toward a clean energy economy. So it can really play a helpful role. As discussed by my fellow panelists, electrification also has to go hand in hand with energy efficiency if we're going to get to where we need to be on climate. So moving off of fossil fuels that are burned on site in buildings. So helping New Yorkers upgrade to healthier, more efficient appliances that are powered with increasingly clean electricity. We have to make sure that building owners are taking steps to move toward electrification, and that we're not locking in fossil fuel infrastructure for years to come. And action at the local and state levels is important to help achieve that goal. So to ensure that the grid is getting cleaner on the supply side, and that we're implementing building level policies that help with the demand side. And that's where the city can really do a lot, as it already has. So reducing energy consumption as much as possible, electrifying space and water heating and cooking, and also ensuring that the power we're using is as clean as possible, coming from renewable sources like wind and solar. The CLCPA, the state's climate law, includes an aggressive renewables target, requiring that we achieve 70% renewables statewide by 2030, moving toward a 100% carbon-free grid by 2040. Right now, we're at about 29% renewables, but the composition of the grid really differs depending on whether you're upstate or downstate in New York City. New York City's grid, though it's pretty dirty now, will become increasingly clean as we move toward 2030, thanks to the state requirements. And as we move to all of these renewable sources, and in particular, as offshore wind comes online later this decade. Again, it's important that we also keep a focus on energy efficiency. So using the least amount of electricity at the right time, which as we're scaling up electrification, will reduce the need to expand distribution grid capacity. And so we'll also ensure that electrified equipment doesn't have to be oversized to make up for heat loss through leaky walls and windows. So all of this will reduce the cost of decarbonizing our buildings and will help us to achieve our renewable goals and other goals that much easier and that much cheaper. So much has been accomplished, but there's still more to do. You can go to the next slide, which is just my contact information. And other jurisdictions are really paying attention and following New York City's lead. There's a groundswell to act, and New York City is really showing other cities what's possible and what the roadmap is. So we really have to lay the foundation now for where we want to be 10, 20, and 30 years from now, making sure energy efficiency is prioritized in Local Law 97 and through other legislation and initiatives, including for smaller buildings, as my fellow panelists mentioned. So beyond what's included in Local Law 97, moving buildings toward electrification and making sure that we're coordinating with the state on all of these efforts to move off of fossil fuels, making sure that our efforts are integrated, that they're complementary, that what the state is doing and that what utilities are doing are really helping us in the best way possible in terms of achieving our targets, in terms of achieving what's in Local Law 97, and making sure that this transition occurs in an equitable way. So thank you very much. And it was great to be here tonight. And I will hand it over to the next panelist.
Great. Thank you so much, Donna. Last but definitely not least, I would like to introduce Marlene Delao. Marlene is a senior research and policy analyst for climate initiatives at Align. She has experience implementing government sustainability and adaptation programs in the US and Latin America. Most recently, she worked for the state of California implementing cap and trade climate equity programs. Marlene holds a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and a master's in city planning from MIT. Marlene.
Thank you, Julie. And I also want to thank NYLCV for putting on this forum and inviting Align to speak. As my colleague in the previous panel might have mentioned, Align is a coalition of labor and community-based organizations that work at the intersection of equity, economic, and climate and environmental issues. At Align, we think that fully implementing and enforcing Local Law 97 that doing this can help the city chip away at the multiple and overlapping problems we are confronting today. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on what we can do from the public building aspect. And I am going to start with a little context for this presentation as well. Next slide, please. So now I know the information you're seeing on this slide is not new. We have a climate crisis, a public health crisis, an economic crisis. We know that exposure to air pollution can increase the severity of COVID-19 outcomes, an issue that is disproportionately affecting Black, Brown, and environmental justice communities. Jobs in green industries, like the rest of the economy, have declined in the wake of COVID-19, but they were also slowing down in growth prior to the pandemic, meaning we're not doing the energy efficiency work, the renewable energy work, and the solar installations, and so on that we need to meet climate change goals. Next slide, please. So beyond the emissions reductions that can be achieved, Local Law 97 has an incredible job creation potential. In 2019, Align estimated that it could help create 23,600 jobs. These were direct and indirect jobs. NYSERDA's 2020 Clean Energy Report states that median wages for construction laborers and energy efficiency can pay between 15 and 44 an hour. It's a bit more for other types of jobs. And so these are decent and well-paying jobs that can become careers for many New Yorkers. Next slide, please. So a University of Massachusetts study compared job creation for various energy industries. As you can see in the colorful graphic, among the top job creating sectors is energy efficiency retrofits at 17 direct and indirect jobs per $1 million invested. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy did a similar analysis. And what I like about their analysis is that they looked at the job creation potential from investing in energy efficiency and the long-term effects on employment that can come from energy savings further down the line. So they did this comparing the scenario where there are active investments in energy efficiency improvements against continuing with business as usual. They found that proactively investing in this type of work yields 45 net jobs from the initial investment and 21 net jobs per year after that from the utility savings. So we are not in a business as usual scenario. So the benefits of implementing Local Law 97 at full steam could be much greater. Next slide, please. So not only can Local Law 97 help tackle the climate crisis, but it also has the potential to reduce economic inequality through well-paying jobs. Now, in order to ensure investments yield well-paying jobs, labor standards must be upheld and maintained. And if we think about not just labor standards, but our workforce development systems, direct entry training programs, pre-apprenticeship programs, we can uplift low-income and environmental justice communities that are continually left behind. Next slide, please. So how do we create green and well-paying jobs? The city has to lead by example. It has to take seriously the task of reducing emissions in public buildings and show the private sector that it is important to invest in energy efficiency. But the city also has to care deeply about its contracting and implementation processes used to achieve those emissions reductions. In my previous work, I did a lot of government contract management, and I know it's not a glamorous job and it can be very difficult, but it's an important process through which taxpayer funds can be used to incentivize hiring New Yorkers who do important and well-paying work. And it can help us achieve not only climate goals, but also jobs and equity goals. So what are the policies that have proven successful in creating well-paying jobs for construction contracts? Project labor agreements, or PLAs. They are pre-hire collective bargaining agreements that raise labor standards by providing prevailing wage and health and pension benefits. They also include no strike and no lockout resolutions that can help complete projects on time. They often include job training programs that ensure quality work and safety at job sites. We also have to go beyond PLAs and find ways to do targeted hiring or to incentivize hiring workers from disadvantaged backgrounds. That could be the long-term unemployed, formerly incarcerated, low-income, and environmental justice communities. The city has done this before. After Hurricane Sandy, the Build It Back program used contracts to hire New Yorkers from low-income backgrounds. Targeted hiring, if implemented correctly, can help us meet racial and economic equity goals. But to do this well, the city must lean on long-standing and strong workforce development organizations. Next slide, please. There are many union-led and community organizations that offer apprenticeship programs and do excellent outreach in disadvantaged communities. The organization Non-Traditional Employment for Women, or NEW, offers a green collar prep program, which is an apprenticeship program that enables women to compete for skilled green jobs. They also offer a boot camp that gives students the opportunity to try the apprenticeship program before committing to the full-time course. SEIU 32BJ offers no-cost training to its members to place them in green jobs. They actually recently presented a wonderful success story with a state government agency about one of their members who was a service sector worker, went through their training program, got a construction job doing energy efficiency work, and is now a full-time instructor in their apprenticeship program. Green City Force is another organization that works with young adults in frontline communities and trains them on various green jobs. They're currently working with NYSERDA to train 50 unemployed and underemployed young adults in energy efficiency. In 2017, the city also started a Green Job Corps program that is preparing 3,000 New Yorkers for green economy jobs. And so we need more of this work. We need to connect these programs directly to green jobs, and we need to scale these efforts. As the city moves forward with energy efficiency and other climate change solutions, it should think about how it can use those efforts to support the creation of well-paying and green jobs. If the city does this, there's no reason why the private sector can't do some of this as well. So to end this presentation, I'll just say that Local Law 97 is an incredible opportunity to tackle and chip away at the multiple problems we're dealing with today: climate change, racial and economic inequality, and unemployment. We shouldn't waste this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I think everyone has highlighted the opportunities here, not just to achieve climate goals, but also for us to be creating jobs. And that's really an important component of this. So we are welcome to take questions. We are going to post another quick poll right now while we're sorting through the questions to see what we would like to, what we can get to before our time is up. Are we putting, there we go. Very similar to the last poll, should be fairly easy and painless to answer. And then I think we touched on this one already, but there's a question about the building efficiency ratings that have been popping up across the city. Chris, I can't remember if you or Adam mentioned that law. There's just a question about what's going on with the ratings, especially because so many of them are very low, and what they mean and how they're going to be used. Who wants to take that first? Chris, you came on mute. I'm guessing you would like to answer.
Yeah, I'll take a pass at it, and then others can jump in. Adam did mention it. So this is a new requirement that has kicked in. So we're seeing these in lobbies around the city. Basically, these are an energy performance rating that looks at the building compared to other similar buildings. So multifamily is compared against multifamily, commercial office is compared against commercial office, and the performance is adjusted for some of the key factors that influence energy use in that building. Things like the hours of operation, or the number of computers in a space if it's a commercial office, and things like the number of bedrooms, or other factors if it's a multifamily building. So the policy aim behind this is disclosure that can motivate action. So you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you're a tenant in a building, you typically don't have any understanding of or access to information about how that building as a whole is using energy. So this rating system is like the food labels or the restaurant grades. For restaurants, it tells you a little bit about how well that building is being managed with energy efficiency in mind. That said, they're not perfect, and there is a range in how buildings are performing, and particularly in the multifamily sector. I think about 50% of buildings are right now getting a D. So hopefully this law will spur a lot of buildings to take a look at energy management, and there's a lot of low-hanging, low-cost fruit that can help nudge them into a higher category, and that's really the aim. Well, I'll leave it at that and invite others to jump in if there's anything else to add.
Yeah, I think Chris covered it really well. One more thing that I would add is it's supposed to bring public awareness to just the idea of sustainable design, not just shaming people. That is an important factor, but many people just don't even think about sustainability when they think about buildings, and when they see sustainability scores, that's the hope. Also, it should spur people who live and work in buildings to hold their boards more accountable, or their landlord more accountable for why their building isn't efficient.
Yeah, the last thing I would just add is that it is a piece of legislation that is very much focused on energy efficiency. And, as we all mentioned and how important energy efficiency is in our presentations, and Local Law 97 will absolutely help drive that, but it's not specifically required. So again, it's another tool to do everything that Adam and Chris have said, but there is a specific focus on basically energy consumption and how your building is doing in that specific respect.
Yep, it's always interesting. It's a little bit different than what you see in your restaurant scores, but it does get people thinking about where you want to live, and consider what that's going to mean for you and how you can make change happen there. If everyone is done on that question, we've talked a lot about wind and solar, and we haven't talked about geothermal. And there's a point that the St. Patrick's Cathedral is famously has constructed a geothermal to support their energy, and that could be a lower priced technology that can be helpful. And the question is, are there plans conceptualizing this as a potential grid system as an alternative to just reducing and retrofitting? I don't know who wants to start that. I can tell you there's a lot of geothermal in New York City from my time in Albany.
Yeah, and I can just start by answering that question. And by saying I think everything is being considered at this point, as both the city and the state are really kind of looking at all opportunities to reduce emissions, all technologies, and of course, New York City looks very different from the rest of the state. So, and especially if we're thinking of, you mentioned St. Patrick's Cathedral, just the density. So all of these things, of course, are in play, and I think are being considered as, people are looking for innovative ways to achieve what we need to achieve in the most cost-effective way possible.
Yep, I agree with that. And I also say, just to highlight, Local Law 97, the primary driver that we've been talking about today is technology neutral for the most part. So, it creates the need to hit the target, but that spurs the market to find the best way to get there. So certainly geothermal's on the table. There are some technical challenges to geothermal, particularly in dense parts of Manhattan. And then there are also issues on the ownership side, the sort of time frame that owners are looking at. St. Patrick's Cathedral is obviously a very long-term view on property ownership, but certainly there are parts of the city where it seems feasible. The city has done an extensive geothermal potential study. There's actually a mapping tool that's available online to help drive people in that direction. But yeah, we expect to see that as part of the package of solutions going forward.
And go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, and I will just say that while it is really important to make sure that our power sources are cleaner, there are many other benefits of Local Law 97, and just making sure that we're getting clean power will mean that we're not getting green jobs, we're not reducing inequity in the built environment. So it's really important that we do retrofitting itself, and also because we want buildings to be more efficient, whether they're being powered cleanly or not.
I think that's especially true as we're going to be pushing for electrification of so many more things. So reducing the amount of waste will be very beneficial, since we're going to be needing sort of more, in particular on the transportation side, and to replace the fossil fuels that we've all talked about today. So some of the questions we have is, that DOB, Buildings Department, has a history of lacking transparency, mismanagement, and being plagued by corruption and enforcement. So what measures have been discussed to prevent Local Law 97 from falling into a similar pattern of administrative issues? Who wants to take a stab at that?
I can jump in on one piece of it, which is that the data at the heart of Local Law 97 is how much energy is your building using and which different types. So that's your electric bill, your gas bill, if you're getting oil deliveries. Most of that data is coming through large utilities, and it's now getting automatically uploaded from the utility straight into the compliance software that's already in use for the benchmarking that Adam mentioned. So there's an annual reporting process that's already in place that's going to get adapted in some fashion for Local Law 97. And the data at the heart of it just goes straight from the utility to that platform. So there's not a lot of opportunity for human error or manipulation there. So that at least helps from a pure, I mean, it's a matter of running an algorithm or a spreadsheet to find out where buildings stand and which ones are over their caps. It's not as simple as that. Of course, there are other opportunities, but that's certainly an important piece to this question.
Yeah, and I think like not specifically getting into you know, I think some questions were raised about history of, you know, corruption or anything like that, but thinking about like just, you know, what a bunch of us talked about, what's specifically needed to ensure that the law is successful, which is really important, right? Again, it's, you know, we want to make sure building owners aren't paying penalties. We want to make sure that we're actually achieving carbon reductions. And again, I can tell you how many questions come up from other cities around the country about what New York City is doing. So there's definitely a lot of focus, not just on what happened in terms of like what the law looks like itself, but what's happening in terms of implementation. So making sure that building owners, many of whom are not sophisticated or not highly sophisticated, that they understand the requirements of the legislation, that outreach is done. And that education is provided, like first and foremost, and then also that the resources are there from the state, from the city, from the utilities. That's so critical in terms of making sure that, again, we're achieving the goals of the legislation. And one other thing, Chris, making that point about data made me think about another and really important role that the city has. So yes, we need to integrate everything that the city is doing with what the state is doing. The city also has a very important voice at the state level in terms of engagement in public service commission proceedings and, you know, just state policy, and is often very active, you know, as many of us are on these issues. And just want to, again, stress that how critical it is to have that city perspective and that city engagement in terms of, again, what is happening at the state level, because it impacts very much what's happening in New York City.
Yeah, and regarding the issues with DOB, I mean, I understand there are a lot of valid concerns, including in the current council, and that is why the law was drafted to have so many safeguards and professional requirements, far more than most laws. All reporting has to be done by architect or engineer, and those are licensed professions. So if someone is paid by an owner to do something illegal, like fudge the numbers, they can have their license revoked. But it's a really serious offense. Someone can lose their entire livelihood for doing that. Also, the director of the Office of Building Energy Performance has to be an architect or engineer. It can't just, I mean, it could be a political appointee, but it can't be someone who isn't qualified to be running that office. That being said, there are a lot of challenges with making sure there are enough good people in that office. You know, it's impossible for the city council to write a law saying X number of people need to be working there to make sure the law works. And that's where there's the concern about how well it will be enforced and if perhaps there are some issues with corruption.
So there's a follow-up question, and you touched on it a little bit, was what are the potential penalties for not complying with Local Law 97 aside from financial? But you know, you just discussed that, you know, our licenses and abilities to conduct business, you know, restricted. There's a question about whether or not public health is involved. I don't know that the health department is involved in this particular law, but Department of Buildings and other agencies, do they have the power to effectively, you know, enforce? And I think we've talked about that pretty extensively. As part of that answer. Sorry, scrolling here through questions. You know, are there things that can or should be done at the executive level to improve sort of outcomes on buildings here? Are there executive orders or other actions that the city or the mayor could undertake? Or are a lot of these things require council action? Who wants to, Donna, you want to start that?
I can just quickly start before Chris jumps in about and I know somebody had mentioned this earlier, just the importance of the city leading by example. And so, and this is something that has been done. Adam had mentioned the other legislation that preceded Local Law 97, just this concept of the city going further and earlier, being more aggressive in terms of what it's doing in its own building so that it's actually demonstrating to the public, to the private sector. I think Marlena talked about this as well, what can be done and how it's done. So certainly leading by example with its own buildings and its own practices is something that's really important.
Anybody want to add?
I'll add one other piece to that. I think the leading by example, absolutely. Marlene mentioned that in her presentation, and the way Donna framed it, I completely agree with. There's also a piece to this that is, we've touched on the implementation through the agencies, but it's bigger than what we've touched on. So for example, there is a sustainable energy loan program called PACE that provides lower cost financing to owners to do energy upgrades. That program is being administered, essentially through the executive side of the city government. So, there's a city green bank called NYSEG, the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, that's administering that, but they're working closely with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And that's a really important part, is how are owners going to pay for this? Energy efficiency pays back. You invest in it up front, but it pays back over time. And the lower cost financing you can get up front, the more work you can do. So that's a really critical piece, and there's a lot of opportunity to get that sustainable energy loan program up and running. It hasn't launched yet, but it will be soon, and ensuring that it's robust and well communicated and advertised and run will be really important too.
And with the executive, the mayor controlling the agency overseeing this law, DOB, the mayor does have a lot of influence in how this law will be enforced by DOB. And even though this is really in the weeds, this will determine whether or not this law is successful. Because of staffing issues, DOB is expected to use a tool called self-certification, which is something which you may have heard from housing groups that is a major cause of abuse of rent stabilized tenants. Which it is, and self-certification is, at least from our perspective at AIA, very dangerous also for people who are involved in design and construction, because what self-certification is it means that an architect or engineer is submitting documents to the Department of Buildings, and the Department of Buildings is not actually reviewing them. They're just assuming that what you're submitting is good. This could be a real problem though if they're not auditing enough of those. So there is nothing in the law that says how many reports or documents need to be audited by DOB. So if DOB doesn't have proper staff and they're only auditing 10% of reports filed, owners can say that fine that I may get, that 10% of the time, that could be a cost of doing business. And so therefore it's really important that whoever the mayor is, when this law is being enforced, is making sure that whatever use of self-certification there is limited.
Great. Anything any panelists want to get in? We are out of time. I give you one last second. All right, well, thank you all for being here today. I want to thank our panelists in particular, Marlene, Donna, Adam, and Chris. Thank you so much for this discussion tonight. If you would like to view the discussion again, or you missed the beginning parts of this, we will be posting the recording on our YouTube page at youtube.com/NYLCV. We hope to see you at our next panel on Thursday at 5:30, which we're going to be covering infrastructure. There is an RSVP link in the chat. Please follow us at NYLCV on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for updates. And if you're not already on our email list, please sign up at www.nylcvef.org. And that is going to do it for this evening. Thank you all for being here and have a great night.